Good evening. Welcome to the Arlington County Board's work session on civilian oversight of law enforcement. We have with us the full board and the manager, and we also have some members of, some leadership members of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, a national nonprofit that we have recently joined. And with us is the immediate past president, virtually, I believe, Brian Corr, and Cameron Mcelhenny, I believe that's correct pronunciation, who's the director of training and education. So we adopted our ordinance in July, creating our community oversight board. And before that, we had already become members of NACOLE, as it's called. And so we're learning together as a group, and I'm ready to send it over. I don't know whether it's, I don't know if there's context that you want to add. Mark, feel free, but I think we're going to go to Mr. Corr. And first, are you there, Mr. Corr?
Yes, I am here, and I'm here with Cameron Mcelhenny. So I'm actually going to turn it over to her as soon as we do our introductions. But again, really very glad to be here. Thank you for working with us, for having us, but most importantly, thank you for joining our civilian oversight family. It's really exciting that we have this opportunity to present to you, and really appreciate the work of the county board, the county manager, the work group that created the proposals. It's been a really great effort, so we're very glad to be here. And then I will just say, again, I'm Brian Corr. I'm the immediate past president of NACOLE, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I've served on the board since 2012, and my day job, as it were, is I work for the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I do civilian oversight of the Cambridge Police Department. So I'm, again, just very glad to be here. I've gotten to work with Arlington quite a bit over the last year, and look forward to our presentation. And I'll turn it over to Cammie, who can introduce herself and start off the beginning of our presentation.
Thank you, and go ahead, Ms. Mcelhenny, and my apologies, I did not see your picture pop up, so thrilled that you're here.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much, and thank you. My name is Cameron Mcelhenny, and I have been involved with NACOLE in one form or another since 1998. I first started as a board member for a civilian review board in Indianapolis, Indiana, and joined NACOLE as part of that experience. And I became a contractor later on after volunteering for the organization for some years, and became its first full-time employee in 2015 as their director of training and education. And so one of the things that I learned as a board member early on is that although well-intentioned, there are not many people out there that know a lot about civilian oversight of law enforcement, that want to make their community better, want to improve police-community relations, but there is a strong learning curve. And so I felt it necessary to devote quite a lot of my life to making sure that people have the information that they need to do the work that they're being asked to do and carry out the mandate of some really important oversight entities across the country. So thank you very much for having us today. I just want to talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss with you today. So first, we're going to go over a brief civil oversight history. We're going to talk a little bit about the models of civilian oversight, an overview of the oversight mechanisms in the United States, as well as talk a little bit about the principles for effective oversight. I know that you guys have already chosen the model of oversight that you'll be following, but I think that it's also good to know a little bit more about what oversight looks like elsewhere, just to kind of know the context that your oversight mechanism fits within. Also, later, Brian will be going over conducting oversight and a little bit of the nuances of your particular county code regarding the Law Enforcement Community Oversight Board and the Independent Policing Auditor. And then to close things out, we'll be talking about identifying and addressing challenges and opportunities, which, although as someone who trains for a living, I feel very attached to the facts and pieces along the way. I do think that that last piece, the identifying and addressing challenges and opportunities, is incredibly important, and also allows all of you to participate a little bit in the process and talk through some of the things that you're hoping for, concerned by as you move forward. So that with that, let's jump in to things. So I normally start almost every training that I do with this slide. So, often people say, well, if we just get a civilian review board and we have some subpoena power, we're going to fix all of the problems. And although those things are very important, there is a lot to be done in order to gain legitimacy, to really have the police maintain the public's trust, to grow that realm of trust. And how a community works to deal with a lack of trust that exists between the police and the public is of utmost importance. The most successful solutions often include a collection of reform efforts and restructuring that impact law enforcement directly. And increasingly, it has really been shown that civilian oversight is an important component in all of these efforts. So while civilian oversight alone cannot bring about the reform needed, no collection of reform efforts is really ever going to be able to directly respond to the concerns and demands of the community without it. So civilian oversight defined. So broadly, civilian oversight is independent, external, and ongoing review of law enforcement agencies and their operations by individuals who are outside of the law enforcement agency being overseen, so outside of sworn law enforcement. It can entail, but doesn't always, or isn't always limited to, the independent investigation of complaints, alleging misconduct, analyzing patterns or trends, data, issuing public reports. Taken together, these functions can promote greater law enforcement accountability, increased transparency, positive change in law enforcement organizations, as well as improved responsiveness to the communities that they serve, all of their needs and concerns. As an independent and neutral body, oversight of law enforcement offers a unique element of legitimacy that internal accountability mechanisms often cannot. Because civilian oversight operates outside of the law enforcement agency, it reports to local stakeholders outside of the law enforcement chain of command. The findings and reports that an oversight agency can put out there are often free from the real or perceived biases that are often associated with law enforcement's internal systems. So really, civilian oversight it allows things to be seen as independent of oversight, much more unbiased, and free of those real or perceived biases. So a little bit about civilian oversight in general. So I will say that there are nearly, well, I need to change this slide a little bit. So at the end of May in 2020, there were nearly 200 oversight entities across the United States. Since the activities and the protests of last summer following George Floyd's death, we have seen an exponential increase in civilian oversight and interest in civilian oversight. Many jurisdictions like yourself have implemented oversight since then. NACOLE itself, and we're definitely not the only organization that jurisdictions are speaking to, but since that time, we've spoken to over 150 different jurisdictions that are in one phase or another of the implementation process. The one thing I'd like to emphasize about those 200 plus oversight agencies that exist, no two are exactly alike. which makes it very difficult when we go to the comparison piece of when we're trying, lots of people ask us what are the best practices, and it's very difficult because so many of them are formed with very specifically to the local context. So, but there are some common threads, as you'll see when we're talking about the models in a bit. So most large cities and large law enforcement agencies have oversight agencies. And this just recently, we finally have the top 10 largest cities in the country now all have civilian oversight now that Phoenix is coming on board. But where we're really seeing the growth are in mid and small sized cities. A lot of the cities that we've been working with in the last several months have all had populations of under 100,000, which 10 years ago really was those size of cities having civilian oversight was very far and few between. Also, it's important to note about civilian oversight that it often happens in reaction to a specific incident of police misconduct or scandal. Although, as you'll see when we talk a little bit more about the history of civilian oversight, that also is changing. There are many more communities that are looking to implement oversight mechanisms so that they can prevent that next big incident or scandal from occurring. So why are some of the reasons that jurisdictions implement civilian oversight? So it builds bridges through stakeholder and community outreach efforts. Really, there is no other entity better positioned than a civilian oversight entity to be that conduit between the community and the police, particularly when your oversight entity includes the community element. Oversight also has mechanisms in place that hold those involved in the process accountable. And I should note that this is not just meant as accountability for law enforcement. There also has to be accountability for the agency itself. It helps limit the city or county to the risks that come about when misconduct goes unchecked. It puts mechanisms in place that allow for good policing to be rewarded, and support is given to uphold good practices and constitutional policing. Because, as you all know, the majority of officers do their job well. They care about their community. But when there is an incident of misconduct or someone does not follow the policies and procedures, there needs to be that accountability to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But at the same time, all of those officers who are doing a good job need to be recognized for that. So many civilian oversight entities not only accept complaints, they also accept commendations. Also, people who can see the process is working and is fair and just will feel more confident in their law enforcement. And by giving civilians a means to address police misconduct and bring transparency to an often very opaque process, you're helping to protect their rights and those that come after them. So a little bit about the evolution of oversight. So on an earlier slide, I'd mentioned about how oversight often used to be established when there was a critical incident or a scandal. And also, oversight used to be primarily a reactive mechanism. Agencies created after a high-profile incident, responding to individual complaints. So you have to wait for misconduct to occur to actually do anything. It normally, reviews policies in the wake of one or more complaints. It used to often emphasize legalistic rules, use an adversarial administrative process, recommending sanctions for individual officers, and really relied on deterrence to prevent future misconduct. Now, there will always be a reactive part of civilian oversight because there needs to be a way to address those complaints that come in of misconduct. However, now, more and more, we are seeing oversight be a proactive process, where it explores problems on the front end through investigation, collection, and analysis of data, that then allows it to identify underlying issues and causes, and focusing on organizational change. It allows for the organization, when it's being proactive, to concentrate on reduction and prevention of misconduct. It builds partnerships with law enforcement. I have to say, more and more, we see law enforcement and civilian oversight working together to solve problems, rather than being that adversarial relationship that used to be so prevalent. Now, I won't say that in every community, everybody is holding hands and singing Kumbaya. That just doesn't always happen, but at least there is an easier transfer of data, that a lot of times law enforcement is seeing the benefits that civilian oversight brings to their organization, and how it helps relationships with communities and law enforcement. And that's by building that bridge. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of civilian oversight, and I will try to keep this brief. As Brian knows, I sometimes get a little excited about the history and just go on, and so I will not bore all of you with all of the details. But civilian oversight didn't start recently. I mean, it's been around for a long time. And in the United States, one of the first oversight mechanisms that we see actually was formed in 1928 in Los Angeles. It was formed by the LA Bar Association. It was called the Committee on Constitutional Rights. And it was formed specifically to review police misconduct complaints. But as you can imagine, because it was not formed by a governmental agency, it really had no authority. It lacked the ability to really get any information from the LAPD. And so it did not last long. However, fast forward a few years and we have the Wickersham Commission, which, although it was originally established to look into the effects of prohibition, it ended up really bringing to light widespread corruption and unacceptable tactics being used by law enforcement. And the real important piece of this is that it recommended that a disinterested agency be established to combat lawlessness in law enforcement. So it's the first time that we really see someone saying that someone outside of law enforcement needs to be engaged in combating things that are going on in law enforcement that should not be. However, even with that, it took another 17 years before we actually see the first official civilian oversight body formed. This came about in Washington, D.C., and the best thing I can say about it is that it just wasn't effective. And it operated between 1948 and 1964, and it only reviewed 54 cases in that entire time. And I'm sure you can imagine there were probably more than 54 cases of misconduct in that time period. It was really seen as weak and ineffectual and was eventually disbanded in 1964. In 1953, we have the first iteration of the New York City Civilian Complaint Board. It was made up of only 3 police commissioners, and it operated completely within the department. So it didn't have any independence. Eventually, in the late 60s, it was expanded to include citizens. But as soon as that happened, a referendum passed to completely abolish it. In 1958, we have the first police advisory board formed in Philadelphia. It was, however, only lasted about 10, 11 years, and it did really little to impact police community relations. However, what's important about it is that it was a board that actually referred complaints to the police for investigation. So we're starting to see something that looks a little bit more like what we see in today's oversight mechanisms. And I think it's important to note that all 3 of these agencies in DC, New York, and Philadelphia, all 3 of those did come back in more in forms that had more authority, and were seen to be more effective than their previous counterparts. Fast forwarding a little bit, we start to see things really look a little bit more as what we now recognize of civilian oversight. So in 1969, the Kansas City, Missouri Office of Citizen Complaints, the OCC, was established. And really what's important about this agency is that it is the longest continuously running agency in the country. It reviews complaints, but it doesn't really have the power to investigate anything independently. But it has maintained itself throughout the last 50 years. I do think it's important to note that there are calls to have it reorganized and to give it more power. So that it may be changing a little bit in the near future. By 1973, we have the first oversight mechanism that is established by voter referendum. The only ones that had anything to do with voter referendum previously were the ones that were disbanded by it. But what's really important about this is it's the first agency to have independent investigative authority. The Detroit Board of Police Commissioners also was established in the same year, and actually had non-sworn investigators as well. By 1980, we had a whopping 13 civilian oversight agencies in operation. By the time we hit the 90s, we start to see another iteration of civilian oversight. That's when we start seeing the auditor monitor model. And really, we see that in San Jose. It was really kind of a big, 93 was a big year for civilian oversight. We see the establishment of auditor monitor models. We see the Citizen Complaint Review Board in New York City is reestablished. We also have a special counsel at the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department with power to investigate the sheriff's operations. And so we start seeing kind of a change of having oversight that doesn't just have primarily community members and the review board model. We're starting to see kind of a professional component to this, where we have paid staff doing work as well alongside the review boards. By the year 2000, we have more than 100 oversight agencies. And then, as I mentioned before, in 2020, we're at approximately 200 civilian oversight agencies in operation. So before I talk about the models, which is one of the next topics up, I want to talk a little bit about legitimacy. So what shapes legitimacy? So the primary issue shaping people's views about legitimacy when they're dealing with the police is whether the police are exercising their authority in fair ways. So when we're talking about that, we're really talking about procedural justice. We're talking about neutrality, whether decisions are unbiased. Respect, is everyone being treated with respect and dignity? Does everyone have a voice in the process? Are they able to tell their side of the story? And is there trust? Do people convey trustworthy motives about those impacted by their decisions? So it's really about, our decisions being made in a fair, neutral, and unbiased way? Are people being treated in a fair, neutral, and courteous way? Procedural justice, I think it's really important to note, is often more important than the legal outcome of those encounters and experiences. So this legitimacy is important not only in law enforcement, which I think is where it often is discussed, much more often. It's also really important in the work of civilian oversight. Those working in and around civilian oversight also have to build that sense of legitimacy with the community so that they're able to operate in an effective and sustainable manner. So in 2000, well, we've been working on this report for so long, I sometimes forget when we actually were able to release it. So just this July, although it had been done for some time, we had a report released that we did in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Justice Community-Oriented Policing Services. So we did 9 cases of case studies of civilian oversight models, a report on the state of the field and effective oversight practices, and then also an interactive online toolkit, the Civilian Oversight Agency Database, or COAD. All of these reports and the COAD are all available on our website, and I will say it's a great way to kind of find out more about not only agencies within your state, but you can also look up agencies. It's a searchable database, so you can look up agencies that are similar to yours and see, once your entity is fully functioning, they'll be able to say, okay, so I'm having this issue, and it would be helpful if I didn't have to reinvent the wheel and contact someone. This database will allow them to find out who's doing similar work, and then allow them to interact with others to see how they're handling those same issues. So also, as part of the evolution and growth of civilian oversight, so at some point in their local histories, nearly every community in the United States has experienced some form of crisis of confidence with the law enforcement agencies. Although mistrust between the law enforcement agency and the community has existed throughout the history of policing, the last several decades have brought increasing attention to the strained relationship that exists there. And also that is only exacerbated in the face of officer-involved shootings, excessive force, allegations of biased policing, and how a community works to deal with that lack of trust is really important. So the most successful solutions often include a collection of reform efforts, including and restructuring that impact law enforcement directly. Increasingly, it's been shown that civilian oversight is an important component in these efforts. So some things just to kind of remember: the number of civilian oversight agencies continue to grow. Arlington County is part of that growth. Data-driven policy analysis is increasingly common. Access to department records and information really varies greatly, but it's incredibly important to the process. Accountability and evaluation requirements for the civilian oversight agency are more prevalent than in the past. And that's that legitimacy piece, trying to hold oversight as accountable as we're hoping to hold the law enforcement agency. And then there's also an increasing focus on front-end accountability rather than only on the back-end accountability. And that's that proactive, reactive piece that I talked about earlier. And then procedural justice and legitimacy with all stakeholders are key for effective civilian oversight. So often when we're having these conversations, I use the word community a lot. And so I often find that I need to stop and talk a little bit about what that really means, because community means different things to different people. So I often like to explain that when I'm talking about community, I'm talking about the broader community, everybody that's under the umbrella. So when you're building legitimacy with all stakeholders and aspects of the community, that also includes law enforcement. Because the work that you're doing, if you have legitimacy with all of the stakeholders, that makes the work, easier, but also more effective. So some types of authority, to kind of get back to our discussion about legitimacy. So what is legitimacy in policing first, before I really dive into the authority? So legitimacy is the belief in policing is the belief that the police are trustworthy, honest, concerned about the well-being of the police, of the people they deal with, that police authority ought to be accepted if one believes it's legitimate, and people should voluntarily accept police decisions and follow police directives, and they should comply with the law and cooperate with police. But there's also an element of legitimacy and oversight, and if oversight is to be legitimate, people must believe that the oversight agency is trustworthy, honest, and concerned about the well-being of people they deal with. That their authority ought to be accepted, that the decisions and recommendations that they make should be accepted, and that people should comply with the law and cooperate with the oversight agency. So there's a couple, so that leads us to the types of authority. So there's statutory authority, the local ordinances, state, federal law. Sometimes we would include in there MOUs, which is applicable here, where there are things where you must have the authority to be able to do certain things. However, there's also legitimacy-based authority, which is more, rather than around local ordinances and laws, it's more about community expectations and values. And it really comes about with the proactive approach, and that there's a willing compliance rather than one that is forced. It's often gained through community outreach and engagement, changing the conditions that lead to police misconduct. So that's looking at, first of all, better understanding between community and law enforcement, looking at policies, procedures, and training to see if there are things that need to be changed. And then also measuring success rather than just measuring numbers and results. So that leads us to the conversation about common models of oversight. So it's really important that no matter what model of oversight is implemented, that there is a basis of legitimacy built in there. So I know that you are very familiar with the review-focused and auditor-monitor-focused models, but I'll just go through these very quickly. But I also will say that each model does have its strengths and weaknesses. And as you know, when deciding what model to implement, communities, jurisdictions really need to carefully assess the history and narrative of the community, the level of support, both financial and political, the level of authority and independence that people are willing to give to an oversight entity, and what are the expected outcomes. And I will say that expected outcomes piece is so important, both now and as the oversight entity starts actually being formed and starting its work, because knowing what those expected outcomes are, and then also allowing all stakeholders, including elected officials, community members, law enforcement, have clear expectations of what the agency can and cannot do will be incredibly important as you move forward. So the review-focused model really ensures it's that piece where the community really gets to be part of the process. They have input into the complaint investigation process. They review investigations, and by doing so may increase public trust in the process because there is that community voice involved. An individual or a board or commission in the review-focused model is authorized to review completed internal investigations and can disagree or agree with the findings. I will say in recent years, review-focused models have also grown to include the authority to review data and policies and procedures and make recommendations, which used to only be found in the auditor, monitor, and investigation-focused models. So we're seeing a move towards having the community members that are involved in the process have some of that authority as well. Next, we have the auditor-monitor focus model. So this is a full-time, and I'm sorry, these two things are switched. So the dark blue, so the dark blue under investigation focused is really what should be under auditor-monitor focused, I'm noticing. So auditor monitors often have more robust reporting practices, which is really important because that is what it's like a light into the process for the community. They're able to have more information in a digestible kind of bite, so that they know what's going on. It's also really, those reports are one of the best ways for the oversight entity to show what they've been doing, what the law enforcement offices or agency has been doing. So the reporting practices of this type of model, I find to be one of the most important aspects of it. It's also very effective at promoting long-term systemic change because you're able to go in and see things that could be better. An excellent example of this is an auditor's office. I believe it's in Tucson. They actually were doing an audit and on complaints that had been received. And one of the things that they noticed is that there was several complaints on chokeholds, that chokeholds were being used on community members when they were being arrested. And chokeholds are out of policy for that police department. And so it was odd that there were several in a row that were happening. So the auditor was able to look and say, well, the badge numbers are very close on the officers who have committed the violation. And going back, then was able to realize that they were in the same recruit class. After a little bit more investigation, they were able to find that in that recruit class, they had a different teacher or trainer who was doing control holds. Normally, someone from the Tucson Police Department would do that training, but they weren't available, so they had someone come in from outside of the police department, from an agency where chokeholds were allowed. And so this entire recruit class had been taught incorrectly as to what the procedure was and the policies were. So it was an easy fix to make sure that that didn't happen again in the future. They were all brought in, they were retrained, and they then understood that they were not allowed to use that. So that's one of the examples of how an auditor-monitor focused model can really be effective at promoting long-term systemic change. It is nice for jurisdictions because it's often less expensive than a full investigative agency, and it allows the agency to actively engage in many or all of the steps of the complaint process, from intake to investigation to review. Then we have the investigation-focused model. So this is where you have full-time civilian investigators that have highly specialized training. Investigations conducted by oversight entities tend to not rely from any investigators within the police department, but there are some instances, like for instance in Seattle, their independent investigative unit is a little different because the head of it is actually the head of internal affairs for the police department. And they do have officers that they've seconded from the police department alongside civilian investigators working together. So sometimes we see it be a little different, but most of the time when we look at cities like DC or Chicago or New York who have independent investigation-focused models, their investigators are solely civilian. And civilian-led investigations can increase community trust in the investigative process. And then lastly, another model you'll be very familiar with is the hybrid. So it really contains elements of one or more of the other models, and it really has been addressed, or it has occurred because it addresses specific issues of the community. And it also, by kind of picking and choosing pieces, it also helps to conform to state laws that might have to be a consideration. Now, I will say there's two different hybrid models. There is the hybrid agency, like we see in Arlington County, where one agency has several different types of models contained within it. We also have the hybrid system. To use, again, Seattle as an example, they have 3 different oversight agencies that are separate from one another, but all have kind of a common goal. So they have a community commission where they have community members who have a main focus on connecting with the community, dealing with community police relationship issues. They also help to review the way that some of the other oversight entities within the city are working. Then you have the Office of Professional Accountability, the one that I mentioned previously that is actually embedded within the Seattle Police Department. And then you also have an Inspector General that reviews investigation, does audits, monitors investigations to make sure. So there's several checks on all of the processes that involved, and they're all working towards mostly proactively to improve policing in the city of Seattle. So next, I want to turn my attention to the principles for effective civilian oversight of law enforcement. So earlier, I had mentioned the report that we released in July, and in the main report, we talk about the 13 principles for effective civilian oversight and how they relate and then guide the practices that are then put into place by any oversight entity. So there are lots of people that have come before NACOLE who have done work and talked about principles. We've taken a lot of those and put them together and added a few more. But really, it's also the work of people like Sam Walker, who's one of the first academics that really focused in on civilian oversight. And I know he's very glad to have company now, but he, in the past, was one of the ones that we relied on for academic research. Also, lots of civilian oversight practitioners have contributed to this process as well. So let me dive into the principles quickly. Now, I realize, and kind of looking at time, I won't go too deep into all of these, but they definitely are included in that report. And the report has lots of examples of how these look in real life agencies. So the number one principle that we have is that independence piece. So really, in order to build legitimacy, particularly with the community, independence is of the utmost importance. And it has to be both real and perceived independence. It has to be, no matter how but anyone is looking at it, they have to see the agency as independent. I realize that sometimes that's difficult because it's part of government, but I know that from looking through your code that you have made great strides to implement that particular principle. And independence, I think it's also important to note, is important not only in the day-to-day operations, but it also has to be something that people, an agency has to also be able to say that it's independent even in times of crisis, where everybody's trying to, make sure everybody's doing something right. The independence piece has to be front and center. The next is a clearly defined and adequate jurisdiction and authority. So in some instances, oversight entities aren't really given exactly what lanes they're supposed to drive in. It's really important to know what an oversight entity can and cannot do, and so that that particularly in a hybrid system where there might be slightly different tasks or authorities for the different pieces of the entity, kind of defining who does what and who has say in what matters. Makes that process much easier in the long run. Also, unfettered access to records and facilities. If you can't have access to data, to records and facilities, and I will say facilities is mostly for jails, those who do oversight of jails and prisons, but not exclusively. But you can't really do the work of oversight if you can't have access. Also, in addition to the records and facilities, access to law enforcement executives and the internal affairs staff is also very important. This wasn't always seen as important because it used to be that there needed to be this great separation between law enforcement and civilian oversight. But having access so that everybody knows what's going on, that when you need information or you have a question about something that has, for instance, you're reading an investigation and there's a glaring omission of the investigative file. Being able to have a relationship with internal affairs so that you can go to them and say, okay, so it looks like this is missing. Was it inadvertently left out, or does it not exist? Or like being able to have that communication with them, it really helps build the effectiveness of the oversight entity. But along with that also goes the full cooperation piece. There are a lot of oversight entities that spend a lot of time running around in circles trying to get the information they need to carry out the mandate they've been given. And so having full cooperation from the law enforcement entity and elected officials is very important. And I think that MOU piece that is included in your code is going to be key in that piece.
I just have a question. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I'm looking at your subsequent slides and kind of thinking about the interactive piece of this towards the end, the questions, thinking strategically. And so I kind of relate to your thought that, these are good values and very helpful, but I also want to give us time for a little bit of interactive, and just so the thought is that we use our half hour to come as best as possible, if that makes sense. And we're also at the end of 4 meetings in one day, which usually we don't do. So want to absorb it, but wanted to see if, we can brainstorm together, or I could just share that thought with you.
No, absolutely. I'm happy to, because you all have this. I know that Brian sent the report over, so all of you have access to this. So I am happy to turn it over to Brian so we can talk a little bit about that. I also know that you wanted to talk a little bit about the actual appointment process and kind of some trends that we're seeing in that. So I'm happy to move over. This is the last slide in this section. So why don't I move things over to Brian, and we can, and just to clarify, do we have until 7:30 or 8?
I guess, we officially have till 8, sorry. That's,
okay.
But I just, we probably have till 8. You will definitely not get my best thinking after 7:40.
Understood.
So,
Definitely understand that.
Absolutely.
I hope it's not too ironic that, once the principals get in, I jumped in the middle of it. But I think we can get a lot from a conversation, because I peeked ahead at the slides and they're super helpful. And what you've presented to this point has also been really, really good for us, I think.
Absolutely. So, Brian, why don't I hand it over to you and then allow you to maybe quickly go through that first part and then get to the last slides maybe sooner rather than later?
Absolutely. No, that is fine, and I'm happy to do it. So let's see. I turned my camera off, so I don't know if you can all see me anymore, but I can see you. So actually, if we could go back just one slide, Cami. So I did just want to take a moment, and apparently you can't see me, so I'm sorry about that.
I can see you.
Oh, okay. I can't see myself on the thing. So I do just want to give a little context very quickly. So, we are talking about civilian oversight in Arlington County. And just so you know about my engagement, I first had a conversation with Rodney Turner, who was chairing the Civilian Review Board subcommittee of the Police Practices Group in September 2020. And he explained the process to me. I was presenting along with a police chief from Illinois, and it was just very interesting to see that Arlington County was doing this in such a thoughtful, organized way and really developed a clear process, not just looking at police practices, but even the specifics around civilian oversight and what kind of oversight was appropriate for the county. So I just wanted to frame that briefly before I jumped into content. So if we can go to the next slide now, please. It's always strange when I'm the person asking for someone to advance the slides. So I won't go through this in great detail, again, just in light of the comments we just heard, but I do just want to make sure that everybody is kind of on the same page, thinking about the role of this oversight board. And again, I'm not going to read through the slide. You have that information. But really, just some of the key things are that the purpose is, I think, in many ways, what we're seeing more and more across the country, as Cammie said, we're seeing things that are not just about taking complaints, but really looking proactively. So while there is definitely there are important functions around reviews and evaluations of policies that exist, accepting and reviewing complaint investigations, there's also really this idea of being proactive, of thinking about what could policing look like in Arlington County? What is it that the diverse communities that make up your county really want and need, and how to do that in a way that is not just about finding fault, but really about proactively creating better policing. So I think that the joint purpose of the Oversight Board and the Independent Policing Auditor is really ultimately to make policing as good as it can possibly be, make law enforcement as effective and community focused as it can be, and really provide public safety that the residents and visitors and people who work and play in Arlington County expect and deserve and need. And again, this one of the things I think is really important is that there's the ability to do concurrent investigations when there are specific situations. That's something that a lot of communities look at and talk about, and there are definitely challenges with that. I think that MOU that will be developed is really important to that, but that is a really important thing that your county has adopted. And I think that it's a trend we're seeing more and more. And the work that you do in Arlington County will help other communities around the country as they think about how to manage a fairly complicated system of checks and balances and authority and responsibility while gaining legitimacy in the county. So we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to try to keep each of these 2 minutes.
This is good because since July, not all of us may have reread the what we passed multiple times. So this is helpful.
Okay, great. Now, we definitely, including in my own city, that is a real issue because I know legislative bodies like your own deal with so many issues, and it's hard to keep it all in your head. So that's part of why we're here. We're happy to do it. And then in terms of the composition of the board, again, you've done things that we've seen in a lot of different communities. One of the things I think is interesting is that you have 2 non-voting members with experience in law enforcement. There are some very specific restrictions on them. They're not a current employee. They're not an immediate family member. And they have had a gap between their service in law enforcement, but you do have them as non-voting members of the board. And many communities, while it's often controversial, have really found that having that experience as part of the discussions really helps because on the one hand, police, anyone in a profession, but law enforcement in general, can become a little bit inured and sort of think, well, if I were in that situation, maybe I would have done the same thing. And you also find that they will flag things that people who don't have a law enforcement background might not necessarily think much about, might not notice. So it's often really helpful to have that voice in the room. And by making those 2 positions non-voting, it also sends a message that those voices are important and the decision-making remains with people who are not, part of or relatively close to law enforcement. Again, some of the other things are fairly standard around boards and commissions, around appointments, reappointments, staggered terms. But I do think that, again, you've created a really good and interesting model that's taken some thinking from a lot of different places and have really grappled with how to address some of these different needs. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The powers and duties of the board, again, it's sort of summarized here on this slide. I do want to highlight that actually getting quarterly reports from the chief, looking at data, traffic stops, arrests, and demographic information is not something that every oversight agency or civilian review board is able to do. And that's really important for them to, again, not just look at individual complaints, but understand the broader context. And that ties right into reviewing police data and having a monitoring system around tracking complaints. All of those things are really important for the oversight agency, the board and the auditor and their staff to make assessments, but also then be able to get those out to the community. It's great if there's transparency within government. It's vital, and it hasn't always happened. But having the board get that information gives them the ability to help make that public in a way that's appropriate. And that's also why it's important that they solicit public input. They have to do community outreach, and they have to do it in a way that really reaches the diversity of the county. So all of that fits into these ideas about reviewing and recommending disciplinary actions, evaluating policies and practices, making reports to the public. But finally, this idea about providing recommendations to the county board, the manager, the police department, that is also something that not every agency can do. And it's really, I think, what we're seeing is an effective practice in many communities, that ability to make those recommendations and have them be taken seriously. So again, the powers and duties of the board, I think, have been well thought out and really will help set up this agency for success. Again, remembering what Cammie talked about, as long as people in the county, people in government, in the police department, on the board are made aware and reminded of what those are. Because as an aside, I'll just say that often when things go wrong in terms of people saying the board's ineffective or it's not doing anything, is when people don't really have a complete understanding of what the board can and can't do. So those pieces around community outreach are all really important, both to hear from the community, but also to let the community know what the board is doing and what it can and can't do. So if we can go to the next slide in this section, Cammie, please. Staffing. Again, I won't go into a lot of detail on this. It's pretty self-explanatory. Fairly traditional staffing structure, independent of the law enforcement agency, but still reporting to the executive. And the county manager in this case is the person who the police chief is responsible to, and also the independent policing auditor. And that kind of model where recognizing that the roles and the staffing and the budgets are not equivalent, but having that equivalence in the organizational chart is really important. I mean, one of the things in my own role in Cambridge is that I report directly to the city manager. And so I have that direct pipeline. And again, the police commissioner probably gets a little more attention than I do on a day-to-day basis. But when I need to talk to the city manager, I have that ability, and I've never had any problem with access. So that staffing piece is really important in that way. And then also that you have an independent police auditor that can independently make hiring and employment decisions. Really, really important. And ultimately, part of what that staff does is receive complaints from the public. And to kind of tie up this section, it's certainly not the only thing, but one of the things that really does make a difference in most communities is for people to be able to make complaints to someone that's not the police department. We all know there are plenty of people who will march right up to the police department, go up to that window, front desk or whatever, and make their complaint. But for every person that feels empowered, entitled, safe enough, self-secure enough to do that, there are many people that don't. So that's all really important. And again, I think I just really appreciate the work that your county has done to create this model, really building on a lot of good work that's happened around the country. So let's go to the next slide and shift into this conversation about challenges and opportunities. And this is intended to be interactive, so I'm going to do a little bit of setting the scene, but really this is a chance to hear from you about your concerns, your hopes, and help you to take a little time to think strategically about what this means for the county, what you hope to see from it, and how you want to support it. So our next slide, you can go here, is Sankofa. Some of you may be familiar with this term. It is a term from the Akan people in West Africa, and what today is the nation of Ghana. And there are a lot of different complicated ways to describe it, but basically this image is a bird with its feet planted facing forward, its head turned back, it's carrying an egg in its mouth. And this represents a lot of different concepts, but ultimately the idea of we have to know where we've come from to know where we're going. And that egg represents the future. You care for it, but you don't see it. You don't know its future. You don't even know what it looks like in that egg, but it's precious. And so this is the way we at NACOLE often frame our own organizational history, but also the work of civilian oversight. And so I'm going to ask people to answer these three questions in a moment, but I do want to just say, just from my own quick research, as young people like to say, there's some really complicated history in Arlington, right? So you've got the history in Virginia, then it became Alexandria County, District of Columbia, retrocession in 1846, which had to do with many things. Historically, it was talked about as it depressed business, but we all know, I think at this point, that those two votes in the Virginia legislature that were slaveholding votes that came out of Alexandria County were very significant at that point in history. And so then you've got the history of Arlington House and Robert E. Lee, historically Black neighborhoods like Green Valley, Knock, Freeman's Village, and Green Valley goes back to the 1840s. So through all that history, and then World War II, government expansion, suburbanization, gentrification, diversity, and now one of the things that those of us in other places think about is what happened in Lafayette Square. And I know that Arlington County really has had a reckoning because some of the Arlington County Police Department were there as mutual aid, a very common, necessary thing in law enforcement. But so I just throw those things out not to set the stage, but just to remind all of you of some of the things that someone from another part of the country thinks about when they think about Arlington and the history around racial justice and equality and law enforcement. So I'm done with that part of the lecture. So now I just really want to invite members of the board to reflect quickly and answer any of these questions from your point of view. Why was this board established? What does Arlington County want in terms of this effort, broadly around police practices, but specifically around civilian oversight? And what do you hope your legacy will be as the county board that adopted this proposal, adopted this ordinance, put it into Chapter 69 of the county code? What will your legacy be? So I'm not in the room, I can't facilitate, so I'm going to allow all of you to take that on, and then after a little bit, we'll go into the next couple of slides.
Colleagues, the next couple of slides, I peeked ahead. Those may be things that you've heard, or should I just not ask that question at this point just yet?
I would love it personally if people could just say a little bit about sort of more their sense of what Arlington wants in general around this, and then we could get into some of those specific questions around civilian oversight and the challenges and opportunities.
Sure. Mr. Dorsey.
So thank you, Brian. A million ways to answer this question. I will just hit on a couple of points. Why was it established? I think at least from my perspective, it's an awareness that it's not enough to do good work. That work has to be perceived and believed to be good by all people who are affected by it. And despite our best efforts, which I think are generally recognized as being strong, we were missing that other piece. And so establishing this is a way to fill the continuum for doing good work, but also having that being well understood by all who are out there. And in terms of the legacy of this thing, I hope, going back to Cammie's history, I hope that this endures 50 years from now because it's able to adapt and respond to be useful for whatever moments are required. I would hate for this to become something, that's blown up in 5 years, and then there's something that happens that causes some need to start something like it again. I hope that this can be elastic and respond to our community as it evolves. And in that case, I will consider our work to be well done.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Go ahead. It's a high bar. Takas, Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you. So in addition to what Christian said, so the reason is that we recognize at some point that trust and accountability are two things that go together. And I think our entire community was clamoring for this, and especially those communities who felt with reason that they had issues with an otherwise very high level of professionalism of our police department. So I do believe that we reacted first to that, but then through the community dialogue, lengthy community dialogue, and the police practices group process, we discovered that we have a lot of things to do to establish the framework of trust and accountability in law enforcement. So this is what Arlington told us that it wants. Mm-hmm. And at the end is the legacy part, which rhymes with that, is safe communities are built on trust and accountability, basically. So I really think that this is a framework that will work both for the community and enable the community to exercise oversight, and on the other side, it will be an amazing opportunity for our law enforcement to collaborate and be part of this process.
Thank you. For my part, I'll just share, I think that in the listening session that we held shortly after the murder of George Floyd, there was a bit of a reckoning for the country and a bit of a sense that in Arlington, we have had and continue to have structural racism and have to address some of that and address it in a deeper way than we had. So I think that that's part of it. I also feel as though the statistical pieces of traffic stops were a factor for me. I also think that we have a professional police department. We were looking to go 21st century and be in the lead in terms of perception. And also, I think centering voices of color and really deeply listening was a factor. But as far as what we want to be, we have in our vision that we want every person to be important. And I'm not sure that I really felt that we were quite there in some ways. And this seemed like a next step to work on it. That's not to say that we're not a wonderful community, but this was a next step. And then I hope that we'll look back and say this 10 years from now, we'll say this is a system, this is a group that keeps us working and is a step forward where everyone feels they have that additional say and legitimacy as you suggested. So those are a couple of thoughts. Ms. Crystal, Katie.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's really helpful to have this conversation. It's one I've been looking forward to. I think my colleagues really articulated well why we're here, right, to answer that meta question represented by the Sankofa, and I love that metaphor that you've given us. The only thing that I would add is I think we've really felt in recent months the sort of the lack of home for these conversations, that there is not really a physical place or locus is a great term for it, where people can bring either their very personal experience. I was stopped and treated in a way that felt disrespectful to me, or can bring their concerns that are, I read nationally that 15 complaints had been brought against Derek Chauvin and nobody did anything about it. How do I know that's not happening in Arlington? And because there was nowhere where people could bring these questions forward in a place that felt, all the values you described, independent, trustworthy, transparent, they have festered. They've come before the board in ways that, we might do our best to answer, but struggle to do so in a way that feels satisfying to people. They've often cropped up or festered in social media, which is a place where all good conversation goes to die. And so, I think the idea of having a locus, to use Takis's terrific word, where people feel conversations are had with great seriousness, with independence, where voices of residents are given equal power with voices of government, is such a exciting and meaningful thing. So that's one of the things that I hope our Civilian Oversight Board will be.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah. So thank you. It's nice to sort of have you here. I wish you were here in the room with us, and I don't even know where to look. If you're seeing the back of my head, I'm sorry. And I'm so glad you got together with Rodney Turner, who has done just yeoman's work for us. So why was this board established? I think we're all sort of saying the same thing, same thing really. To me, I think a lot of it is just where we are in the 21st century and where we are as a nation and a society, and we're realizing how important transparency is. And no powerful institution stays good if it doesn't have oversight. And we've been seeing that for the last 30, 40 years. I mean, it's been very distressing as institution after institution that used to be admired is shown once you get in there and there's transparency, that because there's been no transparency and accountability, bad things happen. And it's just not healthy. So sunshine is good. Sunshine is healthy. So I think it's part of that whole kind of movement. What does Arlington want? I like the point of a locus for the conversation. I think that's Arlington. People want to be heard. They need to come to a place, and this understanding. For myself personally, I have seen throughout this conversation where there are people who feel uncomfortable and threatened by anybody in a uniform, and I haven't lived that kind of experience that a lot of folks have, but I understand a bit where they're coming from. I can see why they're so uncomfortable. And then I hear, and they're angry and upset at our police, whom they don't really know. And then I hear from our police, and they sometimes don't understand why we're fine. Why are these people so upset? They're not understanding the other side either. So this lack of communication and understanding has started to become, with everything going on, sort of toxic in a way. So we really need to get this locus for conversation and real communication and some understanding. So that I think what we want is we want the whole community to work together as a team to keep us all healthy and safe. That's what everybody should be working together as a team. And that's a big, tall order. Legacy. It's so funny. So part of me is thinking a little bit, I guess, where Christian was. I mean, I'm hoping 50 years from now, this is just baked in. I actually don't want a legacy. I just want this to be, I feel like we're remaking the Arlington way, and I hope in like 20 years and moving forward, this is just the way it's always been. It's just how everybody's included, and of course, this is the way we do things, and that the changes we've made here, I hope, it's not going to be a huge thing because of some terrible crisis or some horrible thing. It's just going to work out, and we're going to move forward, and it's going to get baked into what we do and make us stronger and better for it. So, I mean, that's kind of a legacy, but I don't feel like we personally need to get remembered. We just need to do really good, solid work. So, thank you. Thanks for asking. It was kind of...
Thank you, Livy, and it's great to hear from each person. So back to you, I guess, Brian.
All right, well, thank you. And so our next two slides, I'll just say that in the ideal structure, the way we do this, it's sort of revealed, but you all have them. I see them on your desks. So we won't go through them, making you guess them. But so Cam, if you want to just jump to the next image. Again, to make this somewhat interactive, maybe I would just ask a little popcorn style, and I'll recognize it's 7:27. So if different members of the board, if this is acceptable for your meeting structure, might just want to throw out their reactions to some of these things on here. Are these things that are challenges you're seeing, challenges you've experienced yourself in your own work? Do you think these will be challenges for the work of civilian oversight in Arlington County?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, all of them.
Yeah. Any in particular that stand out? Like maybe 2, 3, 4?
Overall. One thing that occurs to me, I'll just popcorn. We'll do it. I might frame a little bit less of lack of understanding of oversight and its role, and more as like the hopes for what this can be or will do are so high from
Yes.
all sides that I worry, there's no community oversight board that could possibly deliver, right? And in fact, a little bit about some stakeholders thinking the others cannot be engaged, or just the sense that there's to some extent this sense that if the quote unquote community is quote unquote winning, then law enforcement is quote losing, right? I'm putting a million scare quotes around that because I don't believe it to be true, but I worry a little bit about some sort of sides, or both. Maybe that falls under the legitimacy with both sides. But everybody's got really high hopes for this, including me. I think, including all of the county board, and I think we'll probably get to this about any advice you have for us in finding the right individuals to do this. Right? I mean, we're sort of looking for superhuman people with a Solomonic judgment and deep empathy and technical expertise, but not too much familiarity with law enforcement, right? So the height of very high expectations, I guess, is sort of what it all comes under.
Yeah. And popcorn style, I'll just jump in. I think we are living at a time of such upset. So any one of these issues, if somebody comes to us and how they feel about it on a scale of 1 to 10, they're all at 11. And it just, everybody is so extreme and so upset. And somehow we need here and actually in everything we do to try to bring the temperature down a little bit, get people to breathe. So this is coming on at a very difficult time, and hopefully we can do it well. And I think we need to be braced. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be bumps, and we might as well just admit that now and hang on. And I think we can, keep the ship from tipping over. I hope.
Yeah. For me, the one that stands out is community trauma, because, and I'm not purporting to know trauma in the ways others sometimes do and often do, but I do feel that there are instances where there's communities, parts of our community at different moments in different places where there's trauma, and I feel that. In social media, I feel that in some of our discussions, and it's hard to hear. So you had your light on, that's why I looked.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just focus on attempting to meet all demands. There are a lot of different reasons people come to this work, and even though we certainly have had extensive conversations about people who've truly endured trauma, we actually haven't heard from many of them. I won't say that we haven't heard from any, but we haven't heard from many. This has largely been a conversation among elites, quite frankly. Yes, I'm a black man who's lived in black skin. I've been pulled over, I believe, because of my skin color, and I've been treated differently because of my skin color, but I've never been assaulted, never been arrested. So, all of these things that are truly deep levels of trauma that build up scar tissue, real resentments, and legitimate resentments, we're not actually engaging with those folks who've lived it. We've had elite discussions about it, not to dismiss them, but I feel like those have been, they have been missing from the conversation, and it's just a gap that worries me. And then because it's been at such an elite level, people are coming at it with all sorts of things that are just mission critical for them. And at least at the outset, I don't see that it's possible to meet all of those demands and needs. So I just fear that all of the tools that elites have at their disposal, whether it be social media or other forms, can serve to sort of delegitimize this whole effort before it's even had a chance to grow and mature and see if it can do good work. So I'm sorry, that sounded really apocalyptic. I apologize for that, but that's the sort of thing that worries me a lot about it.
Takis?
I'm kind of a little bit more optimistic. I think that we have been through a very interesting year. And while I agree with Christian on yes, these are elites or, activists, advocates, the bleeding edge of our conversant society here. And I believe that all these challenges will have to be addressed one way or the other in dialogue. the pathway to trust is the longest one. This will be really difficult until we get everybody involved to say, yes, I actually think that I am in a trustworthy system where there are checks and balances, where accountability is happening, when if something happens, there will be a process that addresses that, assigns responsibility, and fixes the problem. So this is, to me, the currently, the important challenge. Solving for each and one, and I agree, community trauma, change can't wait. It's also a very important one. Dealing with each and every one of these is part and parcel of what this initial process will be, and I really bank a lot on the quality of training and on the quality of the initial board. When we come to these people, they will have a lot of they will have a lot of responsibility to build that basis of trust, to show that this is really a place that is honestly invested in building trust in this community and building on an accountability that, reflects back and builds even more trust. So that's for me the challenge, to find this initial board, train them as good as we possibly can, and support them for what they do.
Yeah, if I could just, I realize part of it too is to make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because I realize on this list in a way, which we've found, I think our police department, not perfect, needs work, but there are a lot of really good things that they do, and I hear really great stories that other people don't hear, and if you try to share those with folks, all of a sudden you're seen as an apologist, and no, you don't really know, and a refusal to accept. And I guess it gets back to the communication thing that I saw before. Refusal on both sides to accept some facts, and both good things about our police department, real trauma that people have actually experienced, and somehow to legitimize both of those and get both sides to hear it is tough.
So I'll just say that you may have seen that we've changed the slide, because as you're having this discussion, I'm hearing you naturally start to move into some of the opportunities, some of which are based in those same challenges. So if others have anything to add about whether the things you've just mentioned or other opportunities that you see in this time, because what you're saying, this is what we hear, this is why it's on the slide, and this is what I experience in my own community. But yeah, how do people see some of these things, building on the last couple of comments, as opportunities as well? And we'll do this popcorn style, since I can't share.
Well, I'll go first. I mean, I think listening to the last three comments, it was very helpful to hear, and to hear you, each of us speak their own truth and at the moment, in addition to the perspective and insight that you have. But for me, to your points, Christian, centering those most impacted there's a depth to that, because our returning citizens may be some of those most impacted, and we probably haven't heard their voices most. And we definitely haven't heard their voices most. But on the hopeful side, for me, the other two that stand out is, I'm confident that we're going to demonstrate something legitimate, and we're going to create something sustainable. And I'm really excited to follow through on the possibility and promise of what we've started. So.
And I also see as just an opportunity to really reflect on government support for oversight and to just really unpack what that means. As you went through the history, Cameron, often it is reactive to a scandal, an incident. There's a particular stakeholder group that has either amassed or leveraged power that's able to get this done, usually with other forces remaining in opposition. And while certainly, there have been questions and thoughts and differing perspectives that have come from the police department and others, what you have here is something pretty unique that I don't think we've celebrated enough. The elected officials, the county manager, and the police department have all embraced this as a necessary way forward. Not just acceptable, okay, but necessary. And, I think once we unspool what all that means, it just gives us great confidence that we'll figure out all of the challenges. We'll figure out all of the things that concern us, because there is I believe, a commitment that will sustain any of us who are in the room and any leader within the police department. So I just see that as a huge opportunity, not just for the success of this effort, but really for moving our community forward.
Katie, this focus for the conversation, it is just rolling around in my head.
Practice his word. It was a good one.
Yeah. I think one of the things that when we actually had some conversations here with people, and we had folks coming in to talk to us whom we've never seen before. And that's a part of an issue. The Arlington way tends to be, we're working on it, we're trying to get better, but it can be somewhat for a certain number of kind of elite insider people. They may not think they're that way, but they are. And it's been hard for us to kind of break out of that and actually reach out and communicate with the entire community. We have not yet figured out how to do that. And I think perhaps this particular structure and organization dealing with the kind of issues it is will maybe really help us crack that nut a little bit and really talk to people that we haven't talked to before about how their government's serving them. So that's a hopeful opportunity for me that I see.
I do also come back to, the folks we need at the table. One of the things, if I could, this isn't necessarily the appropriate time for questions for you all, but if you have reflections for us on this, it's one of the things I think about a lot. I'm feeling hopeful about the opportunity that even though we have pinned a lot on the people who will serve, that we've got some pretty extraordinary members of our community who are interested in this. And I know you all probably followed a little bit. A lot of this had its genesis in a police practices group, and in particular, the Community Oversight Board subcommittee of that group just left me with a lot of hope. I mean, what a thoughtful group of people, and so willing to dedicate their time and make recommendations across some pretty disparate perspectives, right? I think if we can even bottle a half of that, we'll be in good shape with our COB. But one of the things I have thought about a lot, and this has sort of come up in Christian and Libby's comments, is that sense of really wanting to center those most impacted. But we also know that this is going to be a big job that requires a lot of time and dedication. And one of the things we've been wrestling with, frankly, across the enterprise of county government, is how we appropriately compensate people for that time and expertise, because frankly, that is one of the biggest barriers and one of the biggest reasons you see our most heavy-hitting community engagement activities tend to rely disproportionately on, well-off retirees, right? Let's just call it what it is. And so if you have any insights, promising practices, documentation you'd point us towards about, what are some principles or practices around appropriately compensating members of civilian oversight boards in ways that are, sort of sustainable, maintain their independence, but also hopefully have some demonstrated capacity to center the voices of those most impacted. I think that's probably an area where I at least feel like I could use some guidance and assistance.
Okay. Well,
Brian, do you mind if I jump in?
No, perfect. I was just going to say, because we were trying to figure out where to fit this in. So why don't you start off, Cammie, and then I may add a couple of things. But Cammie's worked with people all over the country who've been grappling with this in many different forms and many different ways. And I think she's seen some things that haven't gone so well, but also some real successes.
So I will say that the work that you're asking this board to do really goes beyond what many other city board or commissions are tasked with. There's a lot of community outreach. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of training involved. And as we've seen oversight entities move towards one where you are asking them to do more, looking at stipends. And I will say those stipends vary drastically from city to city. I mean, what you're going to find in Indiana is very different than what, for instance, you'd find in Santa Barbara County in California. And so really it looking at what is common or fair in your community as far as stipends. Something else that others have looked at and implemented is making childcare available for board members, so that you do have people who are not your typical retiree pool to choose from. You want to have young, old, people with families, people without families. I mean, you want to have that run, you want it to run the gamut, and you don't want there to be any impediments to participation. With that said, it is a huge time commitment, and so sometimes it does become very difficult for people to participate. 4 years of really digging in and doing the work can also create some burnout. So just kind of providing what support you can to allow them to do the work in the way that's as easy as possible. And when I talk about stipends, just to kind of back up a minute, a lot of times the stipends are not only for the board meetings, but then also for the training. And sometimes they're at different levels for training versus the actual board meetings. But I do think, now that I have the opportunity to speak on this, I do think, in addition to kind of thinking about how can you make sure as many people as possible can participate, some of the other things that need to be considered is how do we find that broad spectrum of community participation? And sometimes it's looking in places you don't normally look. And your community will be able to help guide you in where, there are advocacy groups that know who the people are with lived experience, or know people who would really be good at this because they have some past, they have some knowledge, or they're a fair and unbiased person. Because really, one of the other pieces about this is that choosing a group of people who are not necessarily there for law enforcement, and they're not there for the community, they're there for the process. I cannot emphasize that enough. And I know that it's very hard because we all come to the table with biases. I mean, it's nearly impossible not to. But finding those people that can kind of push those to the side and be there for the process is really what is going to make this work. And then if they are there for the process, sometimes that makes the work a little bit easier for them as well. So I know I went way beyond your question, but I wanted to make sure I could get in as much of that as possible.
Thank you very much.
That's good. And then if I can just add a little bit, I think Cammie put those things so well. And a couple of small additions from things I've seen is, one issue which sounds very technical is, how do people get access to the materials and when do they get to read them? There are, because of all sorts of different laws and rules and requirements, there are places where every board member has to make an appointment to go to the police department in a secure room and read all the materials before the meeting. I would avoid that if at all possible. And in Cambridge, we found a way. We actually provide the materials, in person to people when necessary. And because we do have concerns about confidentiality, and at the same time, we have to have, this is part of the appointment process, you have to have people that you can trust with that information. And that doesn't mean there's a specific way to do it. It's not necessarily a criminal background check, but that should be part of what you're thinking about. Are these people who can be trusted with, all of the information they're given about community members, around police officers, around witnesses? And I guess the only other area I would add is just the sort of same thing we've said in general about clarity and transparency, just being really clear about the appointment process, letting people know what the process is and what they can expect, being open to changing that process if it turns out that first time around it doesn't go so well or there are really concerns. But it's really, I think, a combination of those structural pieces that make it possible for everybody in the community to potentially have a seat on the board, as long as they're qualified and they fit. And at the same time, thinking about how to help the community understand how people get chosen for the board, why they get chosen for the board, and And as Cammie said, just to emphasize, that they're there for the process. I mean, civilian oversight generally exists because of problems. And yet, when we do our work, we have to be fair and impartial. We can't forget why we're here, but we also have to remember that each case is individual, and we have to look at it on its own merits. I don't know, Cammie, is there anything else you wanted to say about appointments? Because I think after that, I want to kind of jump through the next two slides very quickly, and then just go to our last slide.
Yeah, those next couple, I think we might be ready for, but really helpful, both your comments.
Yeah, thank you. And I know someone had asked us ahead of time if we could talk about that, so we wanted to make sure we fit it in. So thank you, board member Crystal, I think, for asking that question. Okay, I'm figuring it out finally, Microsoft Teams. So if we can go to the next slide about creating sustainable oversight. I will say that these are actually things that you may think about as part of the appointment process. You know, you don't have to ask these questions specifically, but I mean, just as you as a county board want to be thinking about these things, people who get appointed to that board should be thinking about this as well. It's 2021, so you know, what do they hope to see in 2025? Try to get a sense from them of what they think, you know, knowing that it will change. They, as a board, once they're constituted, need to really be thinking about that, as well as how do they set those expectations and how will they measure success. Again, thinking about all of those challenges, and we know expectations will be impossible to meet for everybody in the county, but trying to set those things and then really figure out what those measurements are, because this is one of the reasons that we talk about effective practices instead of best practices, and why it's so hard to compare oversight agencies, because they're all different. And so measuring success in oversight is often not just about how many complaints you received or the percentage of complaints where the findings were that misconduct was sustained, the complaint, but it's much more than that. So people really have to think about that. And then really, how do you, as people have already talked about, actively listen to all voices? And I'll say, just because I usually say this a lot and I haven't today, all of the stakeholders, right? I mean, it's not just those most impacted by negative experiences with law enforcement. It's also people that have good experiences. It's also the law enforcement agency. Now, that's not to say that their experience is the same, or there aren't people who really have been targeted, both traditionally and in our day-to-day lives, by law enforcement, by the criminal legal system. But everybody has to believe that this structure is legitimate to the extent possible. So really, it's all voices while still centering those most impacted. So I don't know if there's any questions or comments, because there's just a couple more slides, but trying to get through the end and not go too fast. But all right. Well, hearing none, let's go on to the next slide. And again, you know, these are just these basic questions, which as a board, you probably want to think about a bit, but this is really going to be for the oversight board and the independent policing auditor. You know, building on opportunities while addressing and understanding challenges. I mean, that's easier said than done, but it's all those things around legitimacy, political capital, and political will. And you know, as you think about the next question, how to build that legitimacy with all stakeholders, you know, working to help people not see things as binary, not as there's the public and the police, there's the community, and there's the criminal legal system. There are two sides, and one's going to win and one's going to lose. Really thinking about how does it support everybody in your community. Clearly thinking about priorities and back burner. Again, the comments people made about expectations are very high. There will be things that just have to be prioritized, and things that maybe you can't do today or this week or this month or this year. And then, of course, this last one, I mean, this is true for all of us, hopefully, but again, easier said than done. How do you adapt? I mean, how do you continue to change and, you know, follow the spirit of the process that created the board, follow the county code, follow the regulations, the MOU, and at the same time be able to adapt and adjust and hear what people are saying, see the impact, see where it's working, see where it's not. all very important things. And again, things I would recommend that people who are thinking about being on the board really are grappling with. And, you may consider asking them some questions along these lines. So before we go to the next slide, which is our last real content slide, any questions or comments about this sort of thinking strategically without doing a SWOT analysis?
It's a whole other work session.
Yeah, I think those two slides are great, and I want to flag and come back to them. But I think better thoughts once we grapple with it a little bit more, at least from my part.
No, absolutely. I think I would think that would be the right way to go. So I guess, Cami, let's go to our last content slide. So some of you may have seen this before if you've done any research about Cami or me, but we both love this image and what it says. So first, I'll just read it. Nothing about us without us is for us. Nothing about us without us is for us. And this, there are different communities that have really embraced this, but it's most often associated with disability rights movements, and it comes out of disability rights and youth activists in South Africa. I will mention that the image is by an artist named Ricardo Levins Morales, based out of Minnesota. His great prints. You should check out his website since we use his image. I like to make sure people think to look him up. But the reason I go on about this image, and I know Cami can do the same thing, is because both the image and the words, it's that thing that we have to remember. That's our grounding for this work, right? We're not here to fix someone else's problem. We're not here to impose an agenda. But if there are people who need better policing, who don't feel safe, law enforcement officers who feel that they're misunderstood, that people don't understand the work that they're doing and what they undergo. I mean, all of these stakeholders all have to be part of this process at every step. And then if we can go to part 2 of the slide, Cami. This quote you may have heard before. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And this is a quote that's often attributed to someone named Lilla Watson, but she would always say that this was actually from her community of Australian Aboriginal activists in Queensland, Australia in the 1970s. And for me, it's very important because the idea so often, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you live in Arlington, Virginia, we have the Cambridge way, you have the Arlington way. So often, people like me, and I imagine perhaps some of you, we want to help people. We want to fix things. We want to get in there and we see this problem and we're going to create this thing that's going to take care of it. And yet it's so easy to do that without really seeing that it's also about us. We're not just helping those oppressed people, but that human liberation, that real need to have lives of dignity and all of the things that, in our founding documents as a nation and speeches, we all talk about. But that's really liberation. And that liberation has to be mutual. We have to recognize that the oppression of others oppresses us. And so in that spirit, we offer these last 2 quotes in this image as you go forward with the work of creating this oversight board and supporting the work and making sure that what Arlington County creates is something that will last for 5, 10, 50 years, will evolve and continue to meet the needs of an ever-evolving Arlington County. So with that, I'm going to stop my lecturing. Cami, I don't know if there's anything you want to say before we bring our section to an end here.
No, I know that it's been a long day for all of you there. And so if there are some additional questions, I actually am going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually see all of you a little bit better. And
We're just trying to figure out.
Well, now we can see ourselves better.
Yeah.
right. Maybe I should not have done that.
No, that's fine.
Well, I'll just say we work with Microsoft Teams at my city, and I still find it challenging. So you're not alone.
Well, I mean, I don't know.
Now we can see you.
I don't know if colleagues have closing thoughts. I mean, I feel as though the phrase that comes to my mind is "let us begin." Let's do the work. So on Monday, we'll put out a call for applications. And I know that several have mentioned how eager we are to get engaged in the official start of this. And so that's kind of the biggest thought that I have. But Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I know you'll wrap us up with edifying closing comments. I do want to just take the opportunity to thank Cameron and Brian. You know, really, this was substantive, inspirational, practical. It really checked a lot of the boxes for what we need moving forward with these next steps. I'm very comforted to know that NACOLE as an organization, and hopefully you too as individuals, will be available as needed. We won't abuse it as we move forward to hopefully guide us with the benefit of your experience. And you know, I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged to have your organization take such an interest in our work, to really look at what we've done, and to really give us both that shot in the arm, but also the sobering dose of reality about how, you know, we may have constructed it the right way, or in many cases using some of the best principles. But you know, there's going to be hard work to go, and we appreciate your support as we move forward.
Thank you, Christian. I think you wrapped it up really well, and just want to emphasize a thanks to both of you. I think the initial grounding of the first 45 minutes or hour really was helpful to each of us, and it is comforting that you're here. So really grateful for the time and the closing inspirational slides, the strategic questions, the whole bit. We've got plenty of work to do, but it is comforting, as you said, that we can seek to call you. But with that, we'll wrap up, unless there. But thank you both. Yeah, and come. We'll have you in person for sure, if the time allows. But a big thank you from each of us.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you all. And to you, Mr. Chair, thank you for helping lead us through this session. I won't speak on behalf of both of us. I'll just say we are very glad to work with you. And I look forward to being able to come to Arlington County in person again. Yes. So I love Arlington County, and there's that place across the river that's kind of almost as cool. But.
Depends, yeah.
We call it the other principal city in the National Capital Region, you know. It's all right.
Very good.
Thank you both. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's been a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.